Who is we? I know that when I ask you that, you're thinking, it's our John. It should be, who are we? Well, a longer, more grammatical version of the question might read something like, who do you include in your concept of we? Or perhaps, how do you define your in-group? However, to me, really is not about definitions or about grammar. We is always about feeling and action. We is empathy and compassion and care. You will know we when you see suffering that causes you to feel suffering so that you are compelled to act. To understand what I mean, let's think carefully about that accusatory question, what about all the black-on-black crime? When a little African-American boy is killed in a Chicago South Side drive-by, some people call it black-on-black crime. What people really mean when they say that is that this wasn't a cute little third grader who loves Spider-Man and helping his grandma bake cookies. This was just some kid, some black kid, and not even a black kid, just a black. In their heart, that boy was not part of we, and we only have tears for we and not for them. The history of humanity is written in we. Every time a border is redrawn or a constitution is rewritten, every time rights are extended or withdrawn, every time wealth is shared or hoarded, every time a child is saved or left to starve, the question, who is we, is in play. Likewise, the big political issues of today are all questions of we. Can we be paid a living wage? Can we be welcomed as Americans? Can we get married? Can we use the right bathroom? Can we not get shot by police? Are debated alongside, can we deny refugee status to them? Can we always get into the healthcare line in front of them? Can we build a wall to keep them out? Just this week, they knew I was writing this and they decided to give me something to talk about. This Fox News commentator, Brian Kilmeade, discussing the Trump administration's treatment of migrants in our southern border, said, and these are not, like it or not, these are not our kids. Show them compassion, but it's not like he's doing this to the people of Idaho or Texas. One of the greatest failures of we, perhaps, and perhaps the measure of ultimate evil in the modern age, was the German government's campaign to murder millions across Europe with the aim of creating living space for their so-called master race. Adolf Hitler, writing in his book, Mein Kampf, wrote, all who are not of a good race in this world are chaff. His vile racial theories encouraged Germans to narrow their we, making far too many of the German people immune to compassion for Jews, Roma, gay men, people with disabilities, and others who became victims of cruelty too difficult to comprehend for both their scale and their savagery. In spite of this immeasurable tragedy, World War II is sprinkled with times where a greater we inspired heroisms large and small. In Nazi-occupied France, residents of the village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon hid refugees, mostly foreign-born Jews, from German authorities. They hid people in schools, hotels, farms, anywhere they could find extra space. Elizabeth Koenig Kaufmann, who was rescued as a child by the people of Le Chambon, recalls her experience. Nobody asked who was Jewish and who was not. Nobody asked where you were from, nobody asked who your father was, or if you could pay. They just accepted each of us. You can hear in her words the simple but overwhelming power of the greater we thriving in that little mountain village. By the time they were liberated in 1944, the 5,000 villagers, along with the residents of the surrounding countryside, had saved the lives of 5,000 people who had come to them for shelter. Sadly, this seemingly large number turned out to be minuscule next to the staggering number of people murdered by Nazis and their collaborators, a ghastly failure of we. In spite of all this sorrow, we can take some heart knowing that past failures of we can be used to inform and inspire better behavior. Raphael Lemkin, the person who coined the term genocide, grew up in Poland in the early 20th century, where he studied law, especially the darkly peculiar instances where national leaders commit targeted murder against their own population. He was Jewish, and he barely escaped the Nazi invasion, fleeing to the United States. Once here, he advocated for the creation of a legal definition of genocide and its inclusion in international law. After the war, he helped during the prosecutions of the Nuremberg trials and later helped to write the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. While working on these projects, Lemkin learned that he had lost 49 members of his family to the Nazi death machine, the very crime he sought to prevent. Now, by now, many of you are probably thinking of other cases like these, terrible events in history like the European invasion of the Americas and the violent destruction of so many nations and cultures here. You might also be thinking of the tragedy at our southern border where the children of refugees are being taken from their parents, or perhaps the Rohingya, or the suspension of DACA, or unarmed black men being gunned down by police. Each of these failed, narrow applications of we deserves our attention, our sorrow, our outrage, and our action where possible. As you run through your own list of inhumanities, I want you to consider one more: climate change. I know that most of the time climate change is presented to us as an environmental problem, rather than an issue of human rights or a crime against humanity. Of course, it would be silly to argue that it's not an environmental problem. Merriam-Webster defines the environment, with a few omitted words, as the complex of factors that act upon a community and determine its survival. Environmental issues, large and small, are often about the survival of a community. Sometimes it's a community of animals. Polar bears and spotted owls and elephants come to mind. But however much climate change is threatening these and other living things, that is not what I'm talking about. Climate change, most urgently, is about the threat it presents to human communities. And when we consider the scale of devastation that climate change has begun to unleash, we must consider that it will come close to meeting the legal definition of genocide. Now, I can imagine that many of you will balk at this proposition. Genocide is when someone tries to murder a whole population. Yes, but let's take a look at what Lemkin wrote about it in his 1944 book that first proposed the term. By genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. Climate change will certainly meet this criteria. Sea level rise induced by a warming planet directly threatens the existence of entire Pacific Island nations, such as Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Maldives, and Micronesia. In an ABC News report, Masao Nakayama, permanent representative of the Federated States of Micronesia, reacted to climate change in this way. The threat is to our existence, survival, not only as a people, as a culture. Still, you may say that sounds somehow different than genocide. Let's read a little further with Lemkin. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of life of national groups. Compare that to the definition of the environment, the survival of a community. An assault on the environment as extreme as climate change will destroy the essential foundations of life of national groups. In addition to drowning entire nations with sea level rise, climate change threatens to destroy the traditional way of life of people from the Arctic to the tropics. According to a United Nations report titled Climate Change and the Indigenous Peoples, the reindeer herding Sami people of Northern Europe and the native people of far northern North America have found that warmer weather has already begun to disrupt local ecosystems and their ability to subsist. Likewise, climate change threatens traditional herders and farmers in the Kalahari Basin while turning the Amazon rainforest into a savanna, destroying the livelihood and culture of the indigenous peoples there. These are just a few of the ways that climate change will have a genocidal effect. I say genocidal effect because I don't want to misrepresent the way Lemkin defines genocide. Lemkin writes that to be genocide, the actions must be carried out with the aim of annihilating groups themselves. Later, the UN definition requires that to be genocide, the acts must be committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part. This is an important distinction that I don't want to gloss over or ignore. Intent matters, just as it does in murder and hate crimes. In spite of that, the rest of the UN definition is interesting. It lists several acts that constitute genocide, including inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Climate change will inflict conditions of life that will bring about the physical destruction of many groups. But the precise definition that requires intent prevents us from applying the term genocide to climate change. However, consider what would happen if we looked at this definition through the legal lens of recklessness. According to Black's Law Dictionary, someone is reckless if they are, quote, careless and indifferent to the welfare of other people. Careless because the reckless person is not really paying attention to what they're doing, but also indifferent to the welfare of other people because those other people are not part of their we. In the context of climate change, our current path is terrifyingly risky. The Union of Concerned Scientists warns us that human-induced climate change will lead to rising sea levels, longer and more damaging wildfire seasons, more destructive hurricanes, more frequent and intensive heat waves, widespread deaths of the world's forest, increased health problems such as asthma and tropical diseases, increased extreme weather, floods, droughts, disruptions in our food supply, shift in the range of wildlife, species extinction, and the destruction of coral reefs. And if that's not enough, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees in a 2017 report warns between 2008 and 2015, 203.4 million people were displaced by disasters, and the likelihood of being displaced by disasters has doubled since the 1970s. We know that there's a terrible risk and that some of those frightening outcomes are already unfolding. And yet our nation runs ahead carelessly with our carbon emissions while indifferent to genocidal effects that it will have on others. Already we have in our legal system a provision for occasions when recklessness leads to death. To truly get a handle on climate change, we need to join this legal concept with established international law regarding genocide to create a new legal term, reckless genocide. Rather than deliberately inflicting, reckless genocide could be defined as someone carelessly inflicting on a group conditions of life that were known or should have been known to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. We are witnessing recklessness in the extreme that will have genocidal effects. There is no international law to hold us to account yet, but there wasn't a law before the Holocaust either. I have to wonder how it is possible that we find ourselves facing this situation. How do we grow up in a post-Holocaust, never-again world, yet find ourselves morally vacant when shown not an endangered species list, but an endangered peoples list? We, meaning we Americans or we in the global north, don't get too worked up about the Maldives. Can you find it on a map? Would the map look any different to you if it wasn't there? Can anyone name any of the indigenous peoples of the Western Amazon basin that will be decimated by climate change? Probably not. I can't without a Google search. They are they. They are not we, and we only have tears for we. Of course, there's more going on than that. It's not just that they're distant, foreign, and faceless, that we're indifferent to their extinction. It is our self-interest to be indifferent. Our economies, the things we produce and consume, are tied to the fossil fuels and animal agriculture that are causing climate change. Even with some enthusiasm for greenhouse gas reductions, the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimated in 2015, right, under Obama, he's trying, that fossil fuels will drop from 81% of the U.S. energy supply to 76% in 2040. The very year we should instead set as a goal for cutting our total carbon emissions by 80% or more. The decline will be so small because the addition of green energy will be almost entirely offset by increases in energy use and population growth. Remember that was 2015 projections based on Obama climate and energy policies. Since Trump took office, fossil fuel extraction has increased. American coal exports increased 61% between 2016 and 2017. Why is this happening? Let's take a look at an essay published by the American Association of Petroleum Geosciences. Let's see what they have to say. The economic prosperity of the United States, and for that matter, your own personal quality of life, depends on reliable access to low-cost energy. If you are not sure of the validity of that statement, simply imagine your way of life without energy. No air conditioning, no travel, no imported goods, no plastics. Assuming that a life without these things is not what you want, then it is very important that you understand the real nature of the energy you depend on. How do we Americans, up to our eyeballs in the society just described, respond to that? Likewise, what will people living decades from now think of us when they read that? When the citizens of the future know that whole nations and other peoples and their peoples were destroyed by climate change, will they understand that we needed suburban shopping malls and basements overflowing with plastic tubs full of more possessions than we know where to put? Will they understand that we needed to knock out the back wall of our home to expand our living room and upgrade from 40-inch to 60-inch televisions with streaming digital and surround sound? Will they agree that a mile is too far to walk or bike to the store, and there just isn't time for that anyway because we're too busy updating our social media? To them, we might sound a little like Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was a middle-class bureaucrat in Nazi Germany. He coordinated the schedules of German trains that crisscrossed Europe. When put on trial after the war, he argued that someone else had loaded those trains with Jews, someone else had unloaded those Jews at Auschwitz, someone else had worked the Jews to the verge of death, and someone else had gassed and incinerated them. He just scheduled the trains. For this reason, he argued, he was legally innocent. He knew why the Jewish people were being loaded onto trains, but he explained he was prevented by the state from following his own principles. No one held a gun to his head and made him do it. Instead, he was just doing his middle-class bureaucratic best to do what was needed and what was told to him. Near the end of his trial, he wrote to the court, "I am overwhelmed by shame when I think about the evil committed against the Jews and the acts that were perpetrated against them." In spite of his proclaimed regret, the fact is that he chose his duty to the German government and his commitment to his middle-class lifestyle, his we, over the lives of millions of Jews, his them. Can we avoid attempting Eichmann's moral contortions? I don't drill for fracked gas or work on an oil rig. I don't mine coal or build pipelines. I don't own a CAFO or work at a meat packing plant. I don't even coordinate the schedules of the trains that deliver these sources of carbon to market. And yet, even as I sat at my computer to write this, I was vexed by the carbon-intensive lifestyle that I and pretty much everyone I know leads. Even as I whine to you about these things, I sound like Eichmann in his letter to the court, where he stated that his proclaimed sorrow for the Jewish people would probably only be interpreted as hypocrisy. Are we morally capable of resisting climate change? If you think yes, and pardon my mixed historical metaphor here, just consider that in 1788, Thomas Jefferson wrote that he would be willing to encounter every sacrifice to bring an end to slavery. This seems fitting with his earlier assertion that all men are created equal and is willing to support a war advancing that cause. Yet we know that Jefferson held people in slavery as he wrote those words, and he held over 600 total in his lifetime. Today, this is scandalous hypocrisy. To Jefferson, it was a problem of practicality. Jefferson's contemporaries asked, "But who would pick the cotton?" And we echo, "But how would we get to work?" I like to believe that as Unitarian Universalists, we are morally capable of working to minimize the effects of climate change. We must find a way, but will we? Are we, as Randolph Byrne challenged, capable of confronting the stupidity and cruelties of our mismanagement of the world? Or are we, as Randolph Byrne states, impotent because we have given in to the insidious trappings of worldly success? Are we, as Wiesel asked, going to listen to his message and feel pain and anguish in the hope of the other, or will we only add to his disappointment because of our indifference? Are we like Jefferson, willing to encounter every sacrifice to save the world from this reckless genocide? Or are we more like Jefferson, resigned to live comfortably, each in our own little suburban Monticello? Will history remember us like the heroic villagers of Le Chambon, or put us on trial like Eichmann? More than likely, history will not remember any one of us individually. Collectively, it will judge what we do in the next 5 to 10 years, the last window of opportunity that we have to turn the corner on climate change. To make a difference on climate, we must broaden our we to include every person, including a subsistence fisherman in Kiribati, and a child in Norway learning to be a reindeer herder, and a mother giving birth in the rainforest-covered hills of western Brazil, and an impoverished rice farmer in the Bengali lowlands. All of these people should be inside our we. We must remember that the way we transport ourselves and all of our stuff can contribute to someone, some other far-flung member of we, the human family, to flee their home as sea levels rise. We must remember that the way we eat may induce droughts that will cause another part of we to starve. We must remember that the size of our heated and cooled homes can cause another part of the world, another part of our we, to lose their home in a flood. As T'Challa says, we must find a way to look after one another as if we're all in one tribe. If you think that climate change seems overwhelming, I urge you to choose some reaction other than despair. Leave despair to the Torres Strait Islander people who subsist off the dying Great Barrier Reef and whose entire way of life is being destroyed by a warming planet. Let us instead choose action. We in Des Moines can take meaningful steps to fight climate change. We could be Le Chambon. We could welcome climate refugees. We could double and redouble our efforts to insulate homes by training low-income youth. We could eat lower on the food chain, expand community gardens, and shop at farmers markets like the Global Greens. We could grant free parking to electric cars downtown and at the airports, and on and on and on, including putting solar panels on our own church. All of this and more could be possible through a citywide climate action plan, a plan that is already in the works but needs broader community support to come to fruition. Climate change is a huge problem, but so was the Nazi occupation of Europe. The only question is whether we Americans, feel compelled by the state to cooperate with that occupation, or will we allow ourselves to be compelled by the pull of a broader global we? We are, as the seventh principle states, part of an interdependent web. The fate of the world, however, seems to hang not on the seventh principle, but on the first, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That principle of ours that answers the question, who is we?